You keep looking online for the reason why your podcast isn't growing, why you're not landing all of these like awesome guests on your show. You're just getting kind of like boring pitches, and why you're not converting listeners into your dream customers. And the reason is likely rooted on your content strategy being too safe. Even though in this podcast I share a lot of frameworks and talk about best practices, sometimes we just got to talk about the problems to identify them and then find the best solution moving forward. That's exactly what we're going to be talking in this week's episode of the Podcast Space. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm an award-winning podcast marketer, and I help business owners just like you get more recognition, get more visibility, and land dream clients from their show. So let's dive immediately into this episode. I hear a lot of podcast hosts talking about how they're looking at their peers and they're seeing what they're doing and they're like, I'm not doing things that differently. Like, why is it that they have a wild, successful show and I don't? While I can't obviously comment on any specific situation without looking at the data and the backend and a lot more information, I'm going to guess that peer is taking a lot more calculated risks than you probably are. And some of these things are going to be resonating. So honestly, take this episode as a way to recognize those patterns and to translate them into actions. They're going to really take you out of that stable place where you've been. So the first reason really is you're normally talking about the same stuff. And not only it is boring for your listeners to constantly have you talk about the same thing. A clear example of this is like someone who has a services-based business and it's constantly talking about the need of the services that they provide and how they're different and what they're doing. But they're doing it in a way that it's almost like every other month they have the same topic and there's barely any new angle or they're adding new information. It's almost like they're treating it almost as a Facebook post about the services that they do. And so people don't want to be sold to on a podcast. They want to be either informed, entertained, or inspired. And so if your podcast is just constantly selling to them, they're going to be like, I don't want to listen to this. So if you're not converting listeners into customers, of course, you have to talk about your products and services, but it cannot be an infomercial, right? There's a balance to be had in this phase. So that's one of the reasons why your downloads may be lower on those episodes, because again, the listener needs to resonate, to connect with this ideal customer that you're serving, but also to be convinced that, they're the right person to work with you, and not necessarily you constantly talking about your services is going to do that. And then number two is you're constantly inviting the same people on the show and the people that you know, the people that you trust. And in these episodes, I feel like I sometimes recognize a lot of us versus them mentality where the hosts bundle up with a guest and kind of our customers are so silly for doing this. And it kind of creates this feeling of you're talking down to them or you're part of a club. And there's, again, I've talked about before on the podcast how there's a balance they need to strike between feeling like you're connected to your guest, but not alienated the listener. And so there's a technique that you can do, right? You're bringing in people, you're making them feel part of a crowd. But if you're constantly talking about in lingo, language that your listeners don't know, they may struggle to connect. And also, if it's always the same people on the show, are you going to be talking about the same things? Or are you going to expand beyond your current network? If you want to become more visible in other circles, you need to be able to invite people who you're not so comfortable with. An exception to this is when you're actually bringing in the same guest, but you talk about things that you know that your listeners can benefit from. So for instance, a clear example of this are two people that I had on the show a few times. So voice actor and coach Nick Redman. So she talked about how to find your voice, because there's a lot of the radio voice, you need to have it. And a lot of people are obsessed about not having tics or having a voice that is podcast sounding, and that's actually not connected to their voice at all. And so there's a lot of elements that benefit the listeners when talking about that, right? Another time she came to talk about the allergies and how to record when you are having allergies or have a cold. That's something that I know my listeners will struggle with, right? And so it's a benefit to them. And then my friend Yesenia Bocanegra, she is a video podcast coach. She's a multilingual. So we talked about multilingual aspect of it, and, you know, how a lot of leaders struggle with showing up because they feel like their English isn't perfect. Other times we talked about, you know, cover art because she used to be a photographer. So even though she came multiple times on the podcast, I had her to explain things that I was like, I could talk about this, but she has such a wealth of knowledge. Again, the ultimate goal is to help the listeners grow their expertise. And I could talk about it, but she has extensive knowledge on it. So again, it helps me grow my business. The goal is there, right? To help bring more organic traffic of people who are seeking those terms. So there's, again, content strategy plan there. But if you're purely just having people on the show and you're talking about everything that is not like necessarily like based on topics that you know your listeners are going to have, it's going to be likely not resonating with them. So another one is to invite your current clients to keep them happy. At some point in my career, I produced a podcast that it was purely out there just to keep the vendors happy. It was a conversation that felt very like a water cooler conversation. And they were talking about things about an event that had happened that no one knew about. I was listening to the show and I had no idea what they were talking about. And so the host didn't really care about the downloads. However, if you're using this format, you have to be aware that that is not going to be doing anything for a current audience, and that's not going to help them really connect to your mission or resonate with what you're selling and how you're helping them. So it's one of the big mistakes that I see is like, oh, well, I'll just have all of my great clients on the show and, you know, like people will feel like, oh, I have such a great connection to them, but there's like no clear intention beyond that. And again, it's fine if all you want is to do that. But again, think about the production cost and does it make sense? So if you are paid, you know, let's say this client is like a $600 retainer client and the production of that episode is going to cost you like $1,000, maybe not the best return on investment for you, right? Another big mistake that I see on content strategy is never using feed drops or highlighting a new show, not collaborating with other hosts. That is one of the highest way to convert new listeners into your show is by promoting other people's podcasts. I see a lot of times people just keep promoting their podcast, but never plug in other people's podcasts or ask peers to do that. Like, your content strategy should not be exclusive to your content. It is totally okay to feature other people's podcasts. I had one episode where I actually had Sarah Heater from Podfox Media, and she talked about the benefits of podcast interviews. And it was such a great episode because I did a little bit of a meta episode where I talked about the benefits of having a guest do either like a podcast swap or to have them on your show to present a topic that you want someone else to do it, and again introduces them to a new host. And again, I wasn't afraid of like my audience leaving me to go to Sarah's podcast. So again, it helped me bring a new awareness to a topic that Sarah, even though she is a podcast strategist as well, she covered in a completely different way than I would have. So the benefit to the listeners, just getting a different take on it. And then another mistake that I see is doing a basic interview, and a basic interview that is basically more like the profile of the person, but like starting the podcast episode with like, hey, tell me about yourself, or what do we need to know about you? It's like, well, does that scream I had no prep work for this interview? Because again, like a great example is like listen through the catalog of the podcast space, and when I had guests, try to like take notes of how I've interviewed this person, how I've highlighted. Give the guest a reason to like you more as a host, right? Like to impress them on how you decided to cover their expertise in a different way, or highlight them in a way as an expert in a different angle that everyone has. Honestly, do this exercise. Go and Google your guest. There's a high chance that every single podcast title is the same. The way that they started the podcast is the same. The show notes look the same. And you want to become a leader, your content strategy needs to be thought out. You can't just go ahead and just like do, a whatever episode and just like do the bare minimum, because the bare minimum podcast episode yields bare minimum results. And another thing that I see that is very, very common is hosts not connecting the products and services that they sell into podcast episodes and talking about the problem that they solve in a podcast episode. And so what ends up happening is that like the path of listener to buyer is not connected. So for instance, one of the services that I offer is I help podcasters, business owners, streamline their processes so they're saving time but being more effective. So that's something that you will see on my episodes, right? I will talk about, for instance, like how to incorporate 3 types of podcast script writing so that you make less mistakes, so that you sound more confident, so that you basically spend less time editing and more time marketing the podcast. Like that's a clear example of how I do this, right? So, but I see a lot of people having a lot of struggle connecting because they feel like, I don't want to sell. I don't want to talk about my products and services. And so they go and do episodes like a day in the life of a podcast strategist. And they never really talk about the connection between the problem that they solve and the product that they have to offer. Or then it feels like when they are at the time of the episode, the end or something, they do like a hard left and suddenly like start promoting their products and services and it feels off. Right? Like it has to be symbiotic. Or if you have a community, like you have to talk about the value of being in community and talk often about the value that will bring to the listener so that it makes sense. And the last one, that is the one that I see the most commonly, is to create content that is too surface level, because you're afraid that if you go too deep, people are not going to buy from you. Now, I've been guilty of sharing almost too much on podcast episodes and go really in depth about stuff. But I feel like there's a lot of fear that if you're a consultant, if you talk about the stuff they're an expert in depth, people are not going to hire you. Now, what is the thing that happens? If you're having a conversation with someone and someone is really gatekeepy, and they kind of like never telling you too much about the thing, you're going to be like, do you even know what you're talking about? Are you just like pretending to know what you know? Or if you're talking about how amazing your products are and how many clients you've served, and you don't have a single podcast episode with a case study or with like a client that you're talking about their process, if you never talk about clients' results in a way that feels like it's real, and if you're not talking about specifically how you help clients solve their problems or share your expertise if you don't solve problems, like think about the stress that there is on the other side, right? And I hear that a lot of people come from it a place of fear because they think, well, people are not going to hire me. But let me tell you, the amount of opportunities that I have gotten to collaborate with brands, to be a speaker at events, to get clients that, followed me for maybe 2 years and they couldn't afford, or they had to work through their own insecurities. And eventually they got to a point that they were able to invest because they said, I saw you talk about the things that I have a problem with, and I've been able to implement some stuff, but now I'm ready to actually work with you because I understand that I can only get so far with free content. So that's like a clear example that as a business owner, you're missing out on having real feedback from your expertise being shared in the world, having that real connection with the listeners and have them, getting them one step closer to becoming clients, or one step closer to connecting to peers who could provide you with opportunities in the future, right? And so there's always benefit in delving into specific topics, incorporating more of who we are, what we value, and how we help people, and expanding and, not playing it safe and really going for what is our goal with the show and being transparent about it and helping people elevate their experience with us as well, whether they're listeners, whether they're guests, whether it's our past self, right? Like we're elevating ourselves. So here comes the pitch. If you want to figure out what is not working on your content strategy, if you've listened to this episode and you're like, oh my God, that's me. Oh my God, that's me. Let's work together to identify what are more sustainable ways to grow your podcast that feel aligned with who you are, the format that you want to do. Maybe you're overwhelmed because you feel like you're editing too much or you're recording for too long and you have no time to do anything else. Let's book a call, visit thepodcastspace.com, and you can definitely learn about the different ways to work with me. And let's get 2025 set up into a great start so that you show up as the leader that you are with the visibility that you deserve. I'll invite you again to keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.